My name is Jill Craneshaw. I am on the faculty at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and I am pleased to have the opportunity to briefly introduce to you our lecturer for this afternoon, Dr. Stephen Boyd. I can say a few formal things about him, some of which you might find in his biography, which is on the website for Wake Forest University, and which say a lot about who Steve is. Steve graduated from Harvard Divinity School and is on the faculty here as the J. Allen Easley Professor of Religion. He teaches courses in the history of Christianity and Christian thought, gender studies, and religion and public life. He's received a couple of awards here on our campus, both for teaching and community service, and he's published a number of books and articles on a range of topics, most of which have to do with advocacy and social justice, community engagement of some sort. I can also say a personal word about working with Steve on the Wake Forest University campus and in Wingate Hall, where our offices both reside. When I first came to Wake Forest University to teach in 1999, Steve was on the faculty of the religion department then, and we almost immediately met one another and began to work on some shared projects. And I have witnessed Steve working here on this campus and in our community tirelessly on a variety of topics that have to do with social change and transformation. So the words that you will hear from him today come from someone who has long experience and much passion and a lot of intellectual knowledge and practical wisdom about how change happens and sadly in some cases doesn't happen in political systems and other kinds of community systems in which we all live and work. I am grateful to Steve for the model that he sets for students here at Wake Forest University, both at the graduate level and in the college. And I am grateful to have a colleague like Steve who so often invites me into conversations and projects like this one where the university gets to do some work around these important issues. Moral Mondays is one of those topics that has arisen in our midst. And I am grateful to you, Steve, for the leadership that you have provided and for the words that you will share with us today. And I know we will all gain much from Steve in hearing him talk about this event through this lecture. This is part of a ZSR library lecture series, and that is why we are here today. And I am thankful to colleagues in the library who have set all of this up and have worked together with us to make this a broader event than the lecture only, because I think there are many different topics at work here. So thank you, colleagues, for that. Steve.
I want to thank Jill, who's the Associate Academic Dean at the Divinity School, and also Gail O'Day, who's the Dean of the Divinity School, who decided to collaborate with the ZSR, there you are, the ZSR Library Lecture Series Committee. And for those committee members who first met with me, I really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk. Carolyn McCallum, Chris Burris, and Lauren Suffoletto. I also want to acknowledge George Reed, who's the director of the North Carolina Council of Churches, for collaborating in this event with the forum. We had a panel, some of you attended before this lecture. We'll have a panel where we go from here after this lecture is concluded, and so I hope you can stay for that as well. And the North Carolina Council of Churches both helped put those panels together and also advertise it. I'm also grateful to my colleagues in the religion department and the core faculty in religion and public engagement for their collegial support over the years, and as well as their challenge and their support for my involvement in Moral Mondays, as well as a number of other things that they might not have expected over the years. I also want to acknowledge and thank Jeff Nichols, who is our ITS, for his technical assistance. Now, anything that goes wrong today is not Jeff's fault. We have a lot of moving parts here, and I hope they all work and move together. But anyway, and then finally, I want to thank Annie O'Brien, who's a master's student in our religion program and graduate assistant, for her help with research and help with the slideshow that some of you came as you came in, and also for her support today. So thank you all for this opportunity. Let me just start by saying that there was a change in the legislature back in 2010. Just to remind you, in 2008, the Democrats had a 16-seat majority in the House and a 10-seat majority in the Senate. And then in 2010, that flipped significantly in both houses, in both the Senate and in the House. 16-seat majority for Republicans in the House and a 12-seat majority in the Senate. It's the first time since 1898, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. The first time since 1898 that the Republicans held both houses. And then in 2012, as you all know, they added the governor's mansion to that and increased to what really constitutes supermajorities in the House, a 34% majority in the House and a 16% majority in the Senate. And I want to just run through several areas in which legislation was passed. Those of you who are part of the NAACP network now know these numbers, but what was happening during the summer was we were getting information about the impact of the legislation. So what I did was I went back to North Carolina Policy Watch and the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters to see what happened in each area. This is not easy to track. There haven't been analyses of the whole legislative session yet. I think these numbers are pretty safe, but I'm going to hand out at the end a handout where you can check the bills yourself. You can check some of the analyses as they continue to take place about what's happened. But anyway, this is the best I could do in the last several weeks with what information is available now. $120 million less than the state budget director said was needed for education was appropriated by this legislature. $120 million less, which meant that we cut 5,200 teaching positions, just over 4,500 teaching assistants. We are 46th in teacher pay in the United States. We're 50th in average increases over the last 10 years. I was talking to someone who was in the school system recently and said the teachers haven't gotten a raise in the last 5 years. Is that correct? I thought it was 3, maybe it's 5 years. The teachers haven't gotten a salary increase. And after 2013-14, there will be no increases for people who complete master's degrees in the school system. They lifted the cap on charter schools. These are privately owned, publicly funded schools. $10 million was allocated next year for vouchers to send students to private schools. 62% of these vouchers would go to students who are already attending these private schools. It doesn't cover the full tuition of a private school, and many low-income students can't afford the balance after this subsidy, and so this goes generally to people, 62% goes to people who are already attending private school as a kind of bonus. In higher education, $400 million was cut from North Carolina Public University system in the last 2 years. Financial aid to 8,000 need-based students was cut. There's a requirement that undocumented students pay out-of-state tuition even if they've lived in North Carolina since they were infants. George Leaf, who is the director of research at the John William Pope Center for Higher Education, it's one of the foundations that Art Pope and his family has begun. The Center for Higher Education has described the funding of higher education as a boondoggle that robs taxpayers. President Shaw of the Center for Higher Education Policy has demanded that the legislature starve the beast. And they are. She said that a lot of radicals have found their niche teaching in the state system. If you starve the beast, the Center for Higher Education will come in and offer to fund like humanities courses for you and economics courses for you in public institutions. At North Carolina State, where the center has donated more than $500,000 for free market-related programs, 12 faculty members in the economics department at North Carolina State are affiliated with the John Locke Foundation, which is one of the foundations started by the Pope family. And we'll get to Art Pope in a little bit. Bill Friday has said that many changes have taken place in higher education, and it's made it out of reach for many poor and middle-income families. What are you doing closing the door to them? That's the war that's on. It's against the role that government can play. I think it's really tragic. That's what made North Carolina different. It was far ahead. We're going through a crisis. With regard to unemployment, North Carolina has the 13th highest percentage of our population living in poverty in the country. But the legislature turned down $60 million worth of federal emergency aid, unemployment aid, which meant that 170,000 people were cut off from unemployment. So we lost an estimated $1.2 billion of economic activity by turning down the $600 million. Does this make sense? Anyway. Criminal justice. Many of you know about the Racial Justice Act. It was championed by then Representative Earlene Parman and Representative Larry Womble from Forsyth County. But the Racial Justice Act essentially said if an inmate can prove racial bias by the use of statewide statistics or local statistics, or if they could prove bias in their individual case, they could have their sentence reduced from death to life without parole. Nobody was ever going free. It was from death to life without parole. That was repealed by this legislature. 31 defendants on death row were sentenced by all white juries. 38 others by juries with only one person of color. Do we have a right to a jury of our peers? Evidently not in North Carolina. Defendants with white victims are 2.6 times more likely to be sentenced to death than if victims are African American. African American jurors are struck more than twice as likely to be struck peremptory challenges by district attorneys. They're more than twice as likely to be struck from jury pools than white jurors. 22% of North Carolina's general population is African American, but African Americans make up 7% of the prison population in North Carolina. I'll slow up. I'd like to get through this part. I studied in graduate school the Reformation. One of my favorite figures, as flawed as he was in some ways, was Martin Luther. He used to say, when you preach, though I'm not preaching, maybe I am, when you preach, it's two things. It's the law and the gospel. It's the bad news and the good news. This is the bad news. It's not been fun putting this part of the PowerPoint together, so bear with me, but we've got to look at it. We've got to look at it. They cut, back in 2011, 1/3 of the prison chaplains were cut, and they also cut funds for prisoner legal services. Tax changes. The tax cuts enacted by this legislature, 66% of the tax cuts will go to the wealthiest 1%. 80% of North Carolina taxpayers will see an increase in their taxes. $650 million per year was lost in tax revenue when this is fully implemented. Over the next 5 years, $2.4 billion in tax revenue. They phased out the earned income tax credit, effectively raising taxes on 907,000 low-wage workers. Included in that are 64,000 military families. Health care. 500,000 low-income adults were denied health care coverage by the refusal to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. That includes 25,000 veterans. 10% of those deprived of health care would be women. Half of those going to Planned Parenthood are patients that depend on Medicaid for prevention services like cancer screening. Expansion would have cut in half the uninsured rates African Americans have as compared to whites. You might note also that African Americans have double the infant mortality rates of whites in North Carolina. North Carolina hospitals will lose $13 billion over the next 10 years, causing layoffs. It's already started happening in our hospitals. This is job creation. Expansion would have saved North Carolina $1 billion in uninsured care in 5 years. 15 of North Carolina's 16 clinics offering abortion and other women's health care services will likely be closed. With regard to the environment, 40% cut to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. The Department of Agriculture, there are 24 vacant positions that will not be filled. Wildlife Resources Commission, 26 vacant positions unfilled. The Division of Water Quality has been eliminated. Its tasks, its work has been rolled over into Water Resources. There was rules reform legislation that requires the yearly reevaluation and reapproval or repeal of all environmental rules. The criterion for the reevaluation is the economic impact of those regulations in North Carolina. All the members of the Energy Management Commission and Coastal Resources Commission were removed and were replaced. Those who were removed brought years of technical and local experience and expertise to those commissions, and they were replaced by new members who are business friendly. The Clean Water Management Trust Fund budget was only $6.75 million for 2013-14, and it's zero going forward. A new slate of members was named to the Mining and Energy Commission. Only 3 of the 16 new members come from conservation or health-related organizations. The rest of the new members come from oil and gas companies and engineers. The legislators instructed the commission to develop a permitting process for fracking by 2015. Now, survey recently showed 75% of North Carolinians say that current environmental standards are either about right or too weak, as opposed to only 13 who say they're too strong. This is not what the people of North Carolina want. Voting rights and campaign policy. It now requires a state-issued photo ID to vote. That's a driver's license or other state-issued document. Starting in 2014?
This election is not. Yeah.
Good. 318,000 registered voters do not have driver's licenses or state-issued ID as required by this law. African Americans are 50% more likely than whites not to have the photo ID. Seniors make up 26% of those without a photo ID, and women make up 66% of those without photo ID. It cut 7 days from early voting period, including Sundays. 56% of the voters used early voting in 2012. 56% of the voters in North Carolina used early voting during 2012. No high school registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. There used to be this mandate that election officials conduct high school registration drives. That was repealed. They will not be conducting, or they won't be required to conduct high school registration drives. The law allows non-poll officials to challenge voter credentials. Think about this for a minute. You go into your precinct to vote, and if somebody from that precinct, not a poll official appointed by the parties or the Board of Elections, can challenge your credentials to vote, can you imagine what's going to be happening? We'll come back to that too. 25% increase in contribution limits on what private donors can give candidates. It also limits public financing of judicial candidates. This law read a lot differently before the Supreme Court, the Shelby Supreme Court decision that lifted Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that required pre-clearance before implementing laws. Do you know that during the period in which that was in effect, Section 4 is in effect, 43 North Carolina voter laws were struck down. 43 were struck down. It's not that we haven't tried this before. Now we're just going to get away with it. Anyway. It's us. It's us. Until we say differently. Anyway, before Shelby, the law that passed the House was like 16 pages. It sat in the Senate until after Shelby was announced, and then it went to the Senate, and it came back 49 pages long with this laundry list of things that restrict voting. Before Shelby, it passed with 4 Democratic votes in the House. After Shelby and after the addition of the additional restrictions, it was a strict party vote. No Democrats voted for it. Whom do the changes affect? African Americans, women, seniors, Latinos, the middle class, the working poor, unemployed, our teachers. And you know, Reverend Leach, I was thinking about the voters, and I forgot all about the children. This affects so many children in our state in so many ways. Whom do the effects benefit? Mostly white, upper class, men and families. Seems to me. White male supremacy today in North Carolina, in America. All of this seems coherent, organized, and comprehensive. Well, it is. Let's keep looking for a minute, and then the better news. Let's keep looking for a minute. You might say, as some Republicans members did during the session, that Democrats held the majority of the General Assembly for 100 years. Now it's Republicans' turn. I kind of thought that myself at the beginning of the session. These things have a way of moving back and forth. But then this agenda and these bills seemed so extreme. To be more extreme than you would expect as with politics as usual. And I think there are at least two reasons why they're more extreme. And they are ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and Art Pope. ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a nonpartisan membership association for conservative state lawmakers and corporations. When I say nonpartisan, among their 104 legislators in leadership positions, committee chairs, task force chairs, etc., in ALEC, there's one Democrat out of 104 legislative leaders. But it's an organization for both lawmakers and for corporations. The values of ALEC, they're very clear on the website. Just go to the website. Limited government, free markets, federalism, states' rights, and individual liberty. Memberships. Two kinds of membership. State legislators, they pay $100 a year, $50 a year. I mean, $100 every 2 years, $50 a year to join. There are about 2,000 state legislators that are a member of ALEC. Corporations pay $7,000, $12,000, or $25,000. I think it's something like Madison, Washington, and Jefferson levels or something like that. Anyway, for corporations. And they have to pay additional fees to be on task forces. I'll get to task forces in a minute. There are about 300 corporations that are members of ALEC. In North Carolina, these are not all of them, I've just picked some. Bank of America, Duke Energy, Reynolds American. Corporations have a significant presence in North Carolina. Bayer, FedEx, GlaxoSmithKline, John Deere, Novartis, Time Warner Cable. Funding, the legislative membership, the $50 a month, comes up to about 2% of the funding of ALEC. Where's the rest of it come from? From the corporations. And from people like billionaires Charles and David Koch. Owners of Koch Industries, the second largest privately owned company in the United States. It does hundreds of billions in annual revenue. They've been affiliated with ALEC for decades, have financially supported it through their foundations, including Americans for Prosperity. and were given its Adam Smith Free Enterprise Award in 1994. The Koch brothers. The task forces on ALEC are education, civil justice, they're organized, civil justice, commerce, insurance, economic development, energy, environment, agriculture, health and human services, justice performance project, task on taxes and physical policy. They have 3 meetings a year. They have an annual meeting, and then they have 2 summits a year. The summits is where the work takes place. At the summits, they meet in task force. So this room would be like the Criminal Justice Task Force, right? And who would be in this room? It would be legislators who sign up for this task force. Maybe back in Raleigh, they're on a justice committee. See what I'm saying? And also in the room will be, and I'll mention this group in just a minute, there'll be let me see if this comes up next. Corrections Corporations of America, a for-profit private prison company. They build and maintain prisons. So if we're in a task force, I'm on a committee responsible for legislation about, say, mandatory sentencing in North Carolina, right? And I'm in the same task force with Corrections Corporations of America. What do we do? What is our job for the day? Our job is to come up with model legislation. We take model legislation back to our states. This is where these bills come from. This is where these bills come from. They're not made up in Raleigh, many of them. And they're introduced in state legislatures. What are the benefits? For legislators, what are the benefits for legislators? Makes their job easier, depending on what they think their job is. They get to sponsor legislation, develop a reputation for being business friendly, and attract campaign donors, if that's what you're in it for. What's the benefits for corporations? It's fairly obvious. Favorable translation. On the ALEC website, it says this: ALEC provides an unparalleled opportunity for corporate leadership to have its voice heard and its perspective appreciated by the legislative members. Unprecedented opportunity to have its voice heard. Examples of legislation with respect to Reynolds and Bayer, they're very concerned about tort reform to limit class action suits against pharmaceutical companies. I've already mentioned Corrections Corporations of America. They're interested in anti-immigration legislation because those who are pending hearing need a place to stay. They need a roof over their head, and Corrections Corporations of America provide that, in addition to state penitentiary system. Connections Academy, it's an online education corporation. It's part of the larger plan to privatize public education. It provides private online schools. Private online schools. I have a handout that we're not going to hand you. Because I told Carolyn, if we hand this out, I won't see your eyes for the rest of the presentation. This is what this handout is. On this side, this is what is this? Is this like, whatever this is, color it is. On this side are ALEC's priorities. And on the website, they say what they are. This also, I got a lot of help from this from the Center for Media and Democracy. What's that? Yes, ALEC Exposed. It's Center for Media and Democracy. So here are ALEC's priorities, and in this column are all the priorities that have already been passed into law in North Carolina. And I had this on a white sheet with yellow highlights for the effect, but anyway, it cost a lot to reproduce yellow highlights in color. But what I asked Annie to do is to do it in bold and italics, but when you see this, they got almost everything. And it's a little frightening to see what they haven't got yet and where they're going. So you'll get this as you leave, a parting gift. As you leave. I also, there's another handout as you leave, and that is this handout. And on either side, these are resources. If you want to look up these bills themselves, this tells you how to do it. If you want to see analyses, including Civitas, Art Pope's organization, you can also look these up and see people doing analysis. You can look at that for yourself. So let me quickly go on. There are 29 current House and 3 Senate members that belong to ALEC. That is current North Carolina House members that belong to ALEC. Speaker of the House Tom Tillis was named ALEC's Legislator of the Year in 2011. That's Art Pope. This is the other source of the legislation. John Hood, who's the head of the Locke Foundation, which was a foundation started by Art Pope and his family, says of the General Assembly, this current General Assembly, John Hood, who we read every Saturday or Sunday in our paper, that's another matter we can talk about, says, a significant number of our recommendations were adopted this year. We favored no new taxes, lifting the cap on charter schools, cutting spending, as well as dozens of small ticket items. Small ticket items. You know, cut 500,000 people, you know, out of health care. That's a small ticket item. Art Pope is another important source for the legislative agenda. If ALEC writes the score, Art Pope is the conductor in North Carolina. He's the chairman and CEO of Variety Wholesalers, which includes Rose's, Maxway, Super 10, and Bargaintown. He graduated from Asheville School, UNC Chapel Hill, and Duke Law School. He served 2 terms in the House. He failed in the bid to become lieutenant governor. He or his family started, it's basically him, started with family money, the John Locke Foundation, Civitas Action, Americans for Prosperity, Center for Higher Education Policy. He's contributed to 27 Koch-supported groups opposing environmental regulations, tax increases, unions, campaign spending limits. He supports child labor laws but opposes compulsory education for minors. He opposes compulsory education for minors. That's public education. He opposes it. He's shaping public discourse in this state. John Hood is syndicated in 50 North Carolina newspapers. He edits Carolina Journal. He's a panelist on North Carolina Spin. His electoral strategy sent Citizens United in 2010, which sort of opened the gates for corporate funding. He spent $40 million in legislative races from 2001 to 2011. In 2010 alone, he spent $2.2 million, and he aimed that money at 22 races. He won 18 of them. He funds attack ads, or the groups he supports funds attack ads. I won't go into that. If you want to ask about that later, I'll be happy to talk about that. Racially charged attack ads. One of the guys who voted for the Racial Justice Act, who was a conservative Democrat, John Snow, former judge, had been a prosecutor, had prosecuted people, had put people on death row, but voted for the Racial Justice Act. One of the mailings that went out to support his opponent and to smear Snow was, thanks to arrogant State Senator John Snow, McCollum, who had raped and murdered an 11-year-old girl, could soon be let off death row. That's the kind of advertising. Mark Farinella, who's a Democratic consultant. In a very real sense, Democrats running for office in North Carolina are always running against Art Pope. There are so many people in North Carolina beholden to Art Pope, it undermines the democratic process. I just wanted to remind us of the flip in 2010 that took place. Art Pope, not singly, but he had a large role to play in that flip that took place in 2010. And it was a critical election because that's when the census happened, and that's when the redistricting took place. And so the districts were redrawn so that it favors Republican candidates. 1898 was the last time Republicans held both houses. What happened to cause this dramatic shift in 2010? The first in 100 years. One thing that happened was Senator Obama was elected president, and he carried North Carolina for the first time since Jimmy Carter. He's black. Just thought I'd mention it. 2013, Governor-elect McCrory named Art Pope State Budget Director. This guy's in charge of our money now. Testimony from the trenches. We've all heard the adage. This is a letter that was in the Winston-Salem Journal toward the end of the legislative session, late July of this summer. It was by a guy from Kernersville. He says, "We've all heard the adage, a liberal is a conservative who hasn't been mugged yet. I propose a conservative is a liberal who's never had to live at or below the poverty line. When my salary was significantly higher, I proudly voted for George W. Bush twice and was an avid Rush Limbaugh fan. Then my employer, small business owner and backbone of America, read job creator, according to, that's my gloss, right? According to Republican theology, sold out his business and retired a millionaire. My family and me, unemployment, foreclosure, bankruptcy, Medicaid, food stamps, free lunch program for our child at school. We were now, according to the Republican dogma, a burden on decent, hard-working, tax-paying citizens of America. Then, with the help of a liberal state-sponsored program, I received tuition assistance, returned to college at age 40, earned a degree, and for now at least make a good living in the healthcare field. Hope he doesn't get laid off. Yes, there are abusers of the system, to be sure, but if it hadn't been for the previously mentioned programs, how would my family have survived? How would we have been able to improve our life situation? How can government effectively weed out the abusers without further hurting and humiliating those truly in need? The Republican Party doesn't have the answers to those questions and isn't interested in looking for them. Not so quick. The Democrats aren't saviors either. Their nanny state tactics will bankrupt us all eventually. Rush isn't completely gone. We the people need to wake up and realize we need a viable third party now. Now, I don't know about a third party, but a lot of people woke up this summer, and this is how I understand what happened with the inception and phenomenal growth of Moral Mondays. The historical frame, in 2007, Dr. William Barber called together the historic Thousands on Jones Street. It's a coalition of 125 branches of the NAACP and 140 social justice organizations. They had an assembly of 3,500 in 2007 and 12,000 in 2012. A 14-point program, quality, diverse public schools, livable wage, universal health care, expanding voting opportunities, abolish racially biased death penalty, and environmental justice. They fought the resegregation of the Wake County schools, championed the Racial Justice Act, backed the eugenics compensation program, same-day registration and voting, and the public awareness campaigns. In the winter and spring of 2013, the NAACP and HKONJ coalition asked to meet with the leadership of the General Assembly and Governor McCrory, and their attempts were rebuffed. They found it a little more difficult to have access to our legislators than the member corporations had at ALEC retreats. We've seen what that does. In April 4, 2013, the 45th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, Speaker Thom Tillis introduced HB 589, the Voter Information Verification and Election Reform Act. That's the monster voting law. April 29, the leadership of NAACP HKONJ decided to exercise our constitutional right to instruct our representatives. I didn't know this. You should know this before I went that day. Article 1, Declaration of Rights, Section 12. The people have a right to assemble together to consult for their common good, to instruct their representatives, and to apply to the General Assembly for redress of grievances. Darn it. But secret political societies are dangerous to the liberties of a free people and shall not be tolerated. Hello? So that's why we went in that building. dangerous indeed. Generally, when ALEC legislative members introduce model legislation, they don't identify where it came from. Here, Dr. Barber speaks to his concerns in an historical perspective.
My father had a master's degree, but in the South, he didn't have protected voting rights. So when we talk about this history of voting rights, I'm born in '63. That means in my lifetime, this is not some ancient history. It's only been in my lifetime that we've had the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So what I say to people when you talk about voting rights and why people get so upset when people now today try to come up with 21st century versions of voter suppression and 21st century versions of Jim Crow and poll taxing, and they act as though, what's wrong? Why are you all complaining? They are ahistorical. After the Civil War, something phenomenal happened called fusion politics, unique to the South. Lincoln Republicans joined with former slaves or freedmen to rewrite constitutions all over the South. Right here in North Carolina, 1868, they rewrote the Constitution. The promises of Reconstruction was that we're going to reconstruct the nation to be more close to its noble ideas, what it said on paper, not what it did in practice. By 1870, in North Carolina, you had more African Americans serving in the General Assembly than you have today. Those legislators, joined with progressive whites, wrote some of the most progressive education laws, labor laws, voting laws, criminal justice laws. I'm talking 144 years ago. By 1872, however, there was a violent reaction by the former planters, and they called it the redemption movement. They needed to redeem America, and particularly the South, from the influence of black political power. They needed to stop fusion politics. Klan was formed in 1872 as a political organization. And by 1898, November 10, 1898, there was a vicious, violent riot called the Wilmington Riots. Duly elected blacks and whites were run out of office. White supremacists took over the state legislature. And the first thing they attacked, there were always 5 things they attacked. They attacked educational laws, they attacked labor laws, they attacked fair criminal justice laws, they attacked taxes. They wanted to cut taxes so that the government wouldn't have any money to fulfill the promises that had been made to the former slaves. And they attacked voting rights. If your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. Or poll taxes, you have to pay something in order to be able to exercise your right to vote. White supremacy is rewritten into the laws of the state. And by 1910, black voting power is virtually nothing, 0. So the Reconstruction movement was ended about late 1800s. Then you get the 1960s. That's the second Reconstruction. Dr. King, March on Washington, 50 years ago, a man in whose shadow we stand, talked about the emancipation, but he also said that things were not yet where they should be. From 54, Brown versus Board of Education, all the way to the death of Dr. King, you have this massive movement, blacks and whites, Jews and Gentiles, all coming together, reconstructing the nation. How was that stopped? They attacked voting rights, they attacked education, they attacked progressive tax policy, but they also attacked leaders. Killed Martin, Medgar, Malcolm, Kennedy, Robert and John, hundreds of others. And that shut down the second Reconstruction. Then you have something strange happen. You have a guy named Barack Obama to run for the president in 2008. And guess what he does? He runs a campaign rooted in the idea of fusion politics, like you had in the 1800s, like you saw in the 1960s. And guess what? He wins in places like North Carolina, in the South. And how does he win? The electorate is broad and it's deep and it's young and it's old and it's LGBT and it's black and it's Hispanic and it's Asian and it's people who want to push America beyond the vestiges of racism. And so his election represents the possibility of a third Reconstruction. And it just might work this time. It just might work. The demographics are changing. More black and brown people. Younger folk are not as bound as they once were. But that new electorate scares the whatever out of those who have a homogeneous view of life. It does not fit their worldview. So what do you see? An all-out assault once again. This attack on voting rights starts immediately after President Obama is elected. Since 1776, when North Carolina was a state, we have never had voter ID. We've had something called signature attestation. You sign your name, and if you lie, you get a 5-year felony. That's sufficient. In order for somebody to actually lie on election day, this is what they would have to do. They'd have to get up in the morning, they'd have to go to a polling place where most people know the people who come to vote, and hope that nobody sitting there knows them. Then they would have to pray that the person they're going to impersonate has not already shown up, because their signature will be on the books. Then they have to sign their name right, correctly, vote, leave, and pray to God that the person doesn't show up. And then in order to have any effect, they'd have to get about 10,000 people to do that and be quiet and not tell anybody. It's ludicrous what they're really suggesting. 1870, the Constitution was amended with the 15th Amendment. No state can deny or abridge the right to vote. Jim Crow was straight out trying to deny. These new tactics, which some call Jim Crow, some call it James Crow Esquire, are attempts to abridge, to put impediments in the way of people participating in the fullness of this democracy. That is unconstitutional. Jim Crow would just blatantly say, you can't vote. Jim Crow said, read the Constitution backward. Jim Crow says, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Jim Crow says, was your grandfather a slave? James Crow Esquire comes along in a suit, gets a computer, goes in the back room, and very slyly uses a computer module and uses the geographic information on race to divide and undermine not only black power, but the power of fusion politics. That's why on February the 9th, we're having a massive people's coalition. We do it every year. Thousands of people are going to the legislature. We're focusing on the poor, but we're saying that if you're going to address poverty and economic justice, you've got to have fair and equitable voting rights, because that's the only place of balance. Poor people can't compete with the rich lobbyists. So they have to have access to the ballot in order to shape the balance of power.
Let me just want to make one comment before we leave Dr. Barber's perspective, and that is the fusion movement fractured in 1898, in the election of 1898. What happened was the Democrats, who had been outvoted in 94 and 96 by this coalition between the Populists and the Republican Party, went on the attack with a very aggressive racist agenda. They warned whites, Democrat, Republican, and Populists of the danger of racially mixed sexual relationships and the mythical violence and brutality of black men. This tactic fueled the Wilmington coup that Dr. Barber referred to, and succeeded in splitting the mostly white members of the Populist Party from their Republican partners. With control of both houses of the General Assembly and the Governor's Mansion, the Democrats ushered in Jim Crow so that African Americans would not have the electoral power to gain political domination or political power again. So, some of you who were here for the previous panel know a little bit about Moral Monday. I'm just going to run through what happened on Moral Mondays. This is the agenda. At 3 o'clock, we met at a local church, as Reverend Leach suggested. We had information and nonviolent training. We knew we might be arrested. There was a possibility we wouldn't. It didn't really make a lot of sense that they arrested us, because here we are today. If they hadn't arrested us, I don't know we'd be here today. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, but we were trained in nonviolent training resistant, as Reverend Womack said. The charges were second-degree trespass, posting and display signs of placards, and failure to disperse upon command. If we were arrested, we were told that the police are not the enemy. They are simply doing their jobs. Do not speak disrespectfully or give any resistance. We wore, I was going to bring, and I forgot, a green armband so that when we went to the rally at 5 o'clock, we went to the rally on Halifax Mall just behind the Legislative Building at 5, and we wore a green armband so that we could be identified by the organizers as people who were willing to go into the building and were willing to be arrested if they arrested people that day. And then we listened to at the rallies, we listened to speeches on the topics of the day, particular topics. That is, having to do with the legislation. At 6 o'clock, those who were going to go into the building and possibly be arrested filed into the Legislative Building. So I just wanted to give you some images. Here's one of the trainings in the church that I went to. Dr. Barber speaking. There were also sermons and singing, so it was both training and inspiration. The worship was talked about with the first panel. Here are just folks who are there. This is just a couple of scenes from the rally on Halifax Mall. Lots of signs, lots of signs. Teacher. Here is the group who have green armbands filing into the Legislative Building. I've identified Dr. Eversley. I looked at these pictures the other night and identified Reverend Leach. I won't send this to the church. No. They know that already, right? So anyway, I just thought I'd identify some of our folks. Again, here they are filing in. Inside the building, there were prayers, speeches, and songs. And the issue was that we sang too loud, I think. That was actually on my arrest papers. Those were the charges. We sang too loud. That is, we were disruptive. This is Reverend Ron LaRoque, who's Winston-Salem Metropolitan Community Church, speaking at the rally. Not at the rally, but inside the building. The people in the downstairs are the people who are willing to be arrested. The people upstairs are taking pictures and supporting, singing. Then around 6:15, Chief Weaver of the Capitol Police would ask us to disperse. He'd repeat his warning at 6:25. At 6:28, he would repeat his warning, and then at 6:30, he would come up to you, as you'll see in a minute, and he would ask. He would tell you that you were under arrest, ask you to put your hands behind you, and you would be then handcuffed by an officer and taken away to the basement where we were searched, and then to the Wake County Detention Center where personal data was taken. We were fingerprinted, we had mugshots taken, and we appeared before the magistrate. A volunteer NAACP attorney was in the room next to the magistrate's office. If anyone had needed help, the magistrate asked us to sign a form saying we would not return to the Legislative Building while the charges were pending, and then most of us who were without a record were released on our promise to appear in district court on the day designated. For those people who had a record, the NAACP arranged to represent them and also post bond if they needed bond posted. And here are just some examples of the arrests. A physician, our own Ann Wilson in Winston-Salem. These are the white handcuffs. Kelly Carpenter, pastor of Green Street United Methodist Church in town. Willard Bass, director of the Institute for Dismantling Racism and at Green Street Church. She's having fun. That's Chief with the thing in his ear. That's Chief Weaver. He was really kind of a friendly guy. He was just doing what he was told to do, we think. You went from the basement to the bus to the detention center. People would stand across from where the buses came out and scream and holler and say, you better get some more jails because there are more people coming. They'd say all kinds of stuff, It was very encouraging. This is the picture of some of us that went down that day Reverend Leach, Reverend Craig Schaub, who's at Parkway United Church of Christ. Parkway United Church of Christ. That's me. Senator Earlene Parman, Reverend Romack, Reverend Bass, and Reverend Dr. Eversley at Delabrook Presbyterian. And then the Moral Mondays turned into the Forward Together, Not One Step Back movement, taking the dream home. We've already heard from the panelists that there were rallies back home in the 13 U.S. congressional districts. I've named them there. We had one in Winston-Salem in September. There was a youth-led Moral Monday, September 16th, the 40th anniversary of the 16th Street church bombing. Here's a picture. We had about 2,000 people at Corponing Plaza in Winston-Salem. And I'd like to close by talking about the perspective of Dr. Vincent Harding. Dr. Harding was a close associate of Dr. King's, an ardent proponent of nonviolence, among other things. He helped draft Dr. King's sermon at Riverside Church in 1967 denouncing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the March for Jobs and Freedom and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Harding wrote this book, Martin Luther King Jr., An Inconvenient Hero. During the observance of the 50th anniversary of those events, Dr. Harding's words may help us now. By inconvenient hero, Dr. Harding meant that we Americans have insisted that Dr. King live forever in the unbroken sunlight of that historic August day on the Mall when hundreds of thousands of us stood in that place, millions more gathered by television sets, to affirm our solidarity with his vision of racial harmony and triumphant freedom. Somehow King seemed easier to manage as a hero. If we could forget the search for economic justice that had already begun to emerge in the march's official purpose for jobs and freedom. If we could ignore the shadows that were soon to be cast across King's life and many others by white terrorist bombing that killed 4 Sunday school children in Birmingham just weeks after that march. On Christmas Eve in 1963, King spoke to his congregation. I must confess to you today that not long after talking about that dream, I started seeing it turn into a nightmare. The first time was when 4 beautiful, unoffending, innocent Negro girls were murdered in the church in Birmingham. Soon followed in 1964 the murders of James Chaney, Michael Goodman, and Mickey Schwimmer in Mississippi, the assassination of Malcolm X and the riots in Watts in 1965, the violent reaction to the march in Chicago for affordable housing and the shooting of James Meredith in 1966, the riots in Newark and Detroit in 1967. King knew well in his visits to northern cities those spasms of violence that were fueled by the impatience and rage that comes from the absence of affordable and adequate housing, work, livable wages, freedom from arbitrary and law enforcement, all things that are necessary for the human life and dignity of everyone. In the 1967 Vietnam sermon, King asked, "How can the administration, with quivering anger, denounce the violence of ghetto Negroes when it is given an example of violence in Asia that shocks the world?" For him, love of God and love of neighbor meant that we are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these human beings any less than our brother and our sister. In 1967, King began to outline a major national nonviolent human rights movement, which would call on the fires of the hearts of the young men and women who were now the victims of America, a movement which would transmute the deep rage of the ghetto into a constructive and creative force, a nonviolent army. The dispossessed of this nation, this is Dr. King, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means to lift the load of poverty. Negroes must, therefore, not only formulate a program, they must fashion new tactics, which do not count on government goodwill, but serve instead to compel unwilling authorities to yield to the mandates of justice. Rabbi Abraham J. Heschel, Dr. King's friend, brother, and marching companion, said shortly before King's assassination, "The future of America depends upon the impact and influence of Dr. King." The future of America depends on the impact and influence of Dr. King. I think he is right even today. A few weeks ago, Michelle Alexander described for us the enormity of mass incarceration here at Wake Forest, for those of you who were able to be there. She called it the new Jim Crow, that traps upwards of 65 million of our mostly African American fellow citizens in a permanent second-class caste in America. She then argued that it will take a multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement to change the legal, economic, and political structures that hold mass incarceration in place. She also said she does not believe the leadership for that movement will come from either of our political parties, but from us. I think Moral Mondays, the North Carolina NAACP, HK-on-J, and all who have rallied to their call can be a beginning of such a movement, at least in our state. The question is whether we can do better in working together than our forebears did at the end of the 19th century, when the white people, frankly, ran away. Or will we let the withering dynamics and patterns of racial prejudice, sexism, homophobia, ageism, and ableism continue to divide us? It's our choice. We need to find our way to one another across these comfortable social barriers, or we're sunk. We cannot underestimate the forces arrayed against us, against such a movement. That was the first part of the that was the first part of the letter. That was the bad news. We can't underestimate this. These folks are organized, it's comprehensive, and they got money. And they're willing to spend it. So we cannot underestimate the forces arrayed against such a movement, but we must open our eyes and we must commit ourselves. At the end of his book, Dr. Harding tells this story. He had been invited to speak on MLK Day at a middle school in Denver, which is now his home. In his talk, he mentioned Dr. King's awareness of the danger he was in. Afterwards, a 14-year-old African-American young man said, "Dr. Harding, I've got a question to ask you. If Dr. King knew that he would be killed at any time, why didn't he just back off? Why didn't he just chill out for a while?" Before Dr. Harding could answer, a young Latina turned to her fellow student and said, "What do you mean chill out? Dr. King couldn't chill out. He had work to do." And so do we. I'll give Dr. Harding the last word here. He dedicates the second edition of his book, of this book, to that young Latina student and to all of our multi-generational and multicultural fellow travelers on the path, in his words, that our beautiful brother and his movement companions were creating and walking before us. Let the work continue. Let the ordered steps move on. We are not alone. We are surrounded. Thank you for your kind attention. One last slide. He's going to be here. We're working on it right now. What we're thinking about in February 17 to 22 is what we're calling an Institute for Nonviolent Social Change. A 4-day institute that will have faculty, students, and staff. We want students to apply to be a part of this institute. There may be course credit for it. We're still working on it. He's agreed to come. We're trying to work out the details now, but at least put that on your calendar. And we hope that this is going to work, and we'll be in touch with you about it. And I wonder, Annie and Carolyn, would you mind passing out? These are the handouts I told you about, and I'd be happy while they're passing those out to take, if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to respond to them. Or is it time to, well, we have about 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, just a minute. Yes, the question? Yes. I think we ought to join the North Carolina NAACP first. I get 3 or 4 emails.
Not one step back.
All right, great. I want to thank you all for being here, allowing me to be here today. As was said, my name is William Barber III. Not the Reverend Doctor, that's my father. Don't get it confused. But I serve as second vice president of the Youth and College Division, as well as field secretary for the North Carolina NAACP. I am extremely excited to be here with you all today. I'm just ecstatic. I'm bubbling over. Right now, as I'm sure you all have already discussed, we're in a critical time. We're in a time where it's really going to set the stage for the next 20 years and more of what kind of state we are going to be. Whether we are going to continue our legacy of being progressive and moving forward towards a better future, or are we going to let big money, old ideals, and the social boundaries that have tried to separate us through the past continue to divide us and set us back countless years. I'm here today just to see the field, build on you all's energy, offer my advice, what I have to offer, and hopefully get a branch up and running here on campus at Wake Forest University. That deserves a round of applause.
Can I introduce Ali just for a minute?
Yes, introduce me.
Ali Chauhan, would you stand? He is the person who is beginning to organize students on campus, undergraduate students. We hope graduate students, Divinity School students will join him. He's going to leave, and you can follow him after this session is over, and they're going to have a brief organizational meeting for the NAACP campus chapter. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, we'll be meeting. Hopefully, they're having a big turnout. We'll be meeting in library room 204. Right now, we'll just be getting a list of people who are interested, and we will be having our meetings every Monday at 5 p.m. We're still starting to get into the details. We're still starting to get into how we're going to get the charter going, how we're going to get everything on the ground and set. But we're pretty confident that we're going to have this thing going pretty soon, and we're going to have a great experience doing it.
Thank you, Ali.
Very briefly, because I'm ready to get to work and get to organizing, but it's on us, you guys. It's on us now. The people in this room are going to be the ones who set the stage of how this state goes. We're going to be the ones who fight this fight. But as Brother Steve said earlier, you all are not alone. Students all across the state are standing up. The youth in college, you all have our full support. And states everywhere are looking to North Carolina and taking courage from our movement. We have heard individuals talking about doing Moral Monday in Wisconsin, doing it as far away as New York. So we're not alone, and this movement is the start of something great.
Right. You want to say something about February, HKLJ in February?
HKLJ, yes. We are mobilizing for HKLJ 8 coming up in February. How many people have participated in the past? Anybody? Anybody?
But we're going to.
Okay, great. So we need you all to come out and come support. As was said, this is the 8th HKLJ that has happened in this state. and every year it has continued to get bigger and broader and stronger and better. We want to make this year one of the best ever. We need you all to do that. Everybody got a cell phone? Anybody got a cell phone? I need you to take your cell phones out real fast. You're not going to get charged, don't worry. Text NAACP to 46988.
So in my text, I put NAACP
Mhm.
and then the number.
46988 to the sender.
And then hit send.
And somebody should get a response. Let me know when you get a response.
Yeah.
What's it say?
You are signed up for NAACP HKONJ movement newsletters. You may receive up to 10 messages per month. Message and data rates may apply.
Now it says it may apply, but most of us have free text. Am I right? Am I right? Okay. So you are now locked into our constant contact network. Say the NAACP to 46988.
Can you stay around for a bit, or do you want to go meet with the students at the NAACP chapter?
Yeah, I'm going.
She said you could stay on the panel. We're going to have a panel now about where we go from here.
Okay.
Or
Yeah,
you can-
I'm gonna help them.
Good. That's
chapter.
good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
I'm gonna help them
Okay,
set
great.
up.
They're going to take off. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
It's nice to meet you.
That's-
Yeah, yeah, yeah.